Hi, I'm James Carazzo. I, alongside Nicole and a few others, are part of the Design Research Society's educational special interest group, of which this Futures of Design Education talk is very much part of. Um, this is, as Nicole's already told us, this is like our biggest sellout ever in terms of like interest, not like conceptually. Um, in fact, I hadn't realized how well the registrations were going until I got an email from our keynote speaker today, Layla, who said, I can't get a ticket for my own event, and therefore Layla couldn't get a link to come in. So luckily, we were able to increase the amount of registrations. So thankfully, Layla's been able to join us. But more seriously, I think really perhaps the interest speaks to kind of the importance and the resonance and the power of what Layla's here to talk about today. Absolutely delighted to welcome Layla. I Layla's just completed her PhD at Sheffield Hallam University, and I have had the privilege, and I'm not using that word lightly, of being part of Layla's supervision team, and I've known Layla for a number of years. So I was thinking like what I wanted to say about Layla is by way of introduction. Are you able to mute that, Nicole?
Yes, but I have to search through this.
I'll just pause for a second. Oh, I think it's gone off now. And as always with Layla, I found that Layla is always more eloquent, more wise in terms of how she writes and what she says about things. So I'm actually going to use some of Layla's own words by way of introducing Layla. So this comes from the very first paragraph of the acknowledgements in her PhD. And I'll read out this short bit, and then I'm going to hand over to our speaker today, Layla. So these are Layla's words. At the heart of this work is love. Love as care, as justice, and as a way of shaping something good in the world, however small that may be. For small is good, small is all. The large is a reflection of the small. When I first questioned whether I was capable of carrying out this research, I found some quiet strength in the words of Octavia Butler, where she wrote so beautifully that tomorrow is the child of our today. Through thought and deed, we exert a great deal of influence over this child, even though we can't control it absolutely. Best to think about it, though. Best to try to shape it into something good. So Layla finishes by saying this work, i.e. the PhD, which you're going to hear a lot about today, is in entire dedication to that idea of trying and continuing to try to shape something good. Layla, we're thrilled to have you today. I'm going to mute my mic and hand straight over to you.
Oh, thank you for that, James. It's hard to follow Octavia Butler, though. I feel like you've set me up slightly. But yeah, thank you. And thanks to Nicole and James for that lovely introduction. And yeah, totally overwhelmed by how many of you are probably taking your lunch break to spend some time with us. So I appreciate that. And I will try and be engaging somewhat. But yeah, really, really appreciate being part of the DRS group that you've got putting these talks on. I think you're nurturing a really important space for us to be able to gather and have these conversations. I know the work that it takes to kind of facilitate those things. So I appreciate you guys. Thank you. I will start sharing my screen because it's always nice to kind of talk against a backdrop. So let's see if I can do that. And if James, could you just give me a thumbs up if that's on your screen?
Verbal thumbs up.
Thank you. Okay, perfect. So yes, my name is Layla, and I am a design educator, researcher, very, very recent PhD finisher. And the title I've given today's talk is Decolonising Design Education Between Care, Change and Collapse. And yeah, I just want to acknowledge before we start that I'm very aware that people will be arriving to this from different spaces, different places, different disciplines, different relationships to design, different relationships to decolonisation and what that word means and how that word means different things to different people. And I'm definitely not here to provide any kind of blueprint. And I do think it's a word that holds different meaning and resonance depending on where we are in the world, our heritage and whatnot. So yeah, thought I'd start with that. And just kind of say that I'm trying to deal with lived experiences within this talk. So there'll be a lot of working with participants who have been affected by some of this stuff. So yeah, I'm trying to stay away from abstract language because I, don't like it when that happens. So I will do my best. So yeah, the basis of the talk is a reflection on and compilation of, I guess, certain parts of my recently completed PhD. So yes, I have just finished. And the title of that was Decolonising Design Education, Assembling Caring Futures. And when I was putting this together recently, I was slightly concerned of how to kind of like compile almost 4 years of research into 30 minutes. So yeah, it's a little tricky. So forgive me if there's parts that I don't quite fully get into in the best way, but my thesis will be published and public soon. So please, yeah, if you want to stay updated on any of those kind of things, I'm on Instagram, I'm on LinkedIn. Let's chat. So you can follow along and when that's live. Have a glance. So yeah, on the screen right now anyways, there's a reflection selection of images from across the course of my PhD. I'm kind of very interested in participatory methods of gathering people into spaces to collectively dream alternatives, I guess, on some level. So thinking about how we might do and be differently in design education is a big part of the kind of work I'm interested in. And yeah, I approach that kind of work through this decolonial perspective, applying that lens to the encounters I have with these various participants. So yeah, over the full course of the PhD, I think speaking with and gathering and being with people who are part of design education on different levels, whether that be students or educators or people in management, kind of speaking to the different people involved in these contexts really became an important premise of how I kind of did the research. But it became a very a conversation in parts with other people. So yeah, I guess kind of covered that, but my practice sits at the edges of design education, decolonisation, collective dreaming. And at the beginning of my PhD, I kind of had this key question I was working with, which was how can speculative participatory practice create actionable ways towards decolonising design education? And before starting my doctorate, I was kind of already developing a practice that was grounded in workshops. I was really interested in gathering people in different variations and facilitating moments where we could imagine alternative possibilities. I think what shifted during my PhD was that I became much more comfortable drawing from my own heritage and positionality. I was interested in how my other ways of knowing had not perhaps been evident in my design education up until that point. So foregrounding, I guess, myself within that work and being open about my positionality became really important to me during this process. So I did want to begin a little bit with my positionality. I guess not as a disclaimer, but as grounding. So it's something I kind of like to do at the beginning of any kind of presentation or talk I kind of give as a way of situating where I'm positioned in relation to the research and conversations I'm having, generating, sharing. So the images that you're seeing on the screen and the lovely video of my auntie making dolma, which is a very nice Iraqi dish, is of my Iraqi Turkmen heritage. So I come from a very loud, textured, excessive, emotional, at times colourful background full of food, family and noise. And I'm starting here because for a long time this part of me felt incompatible with the kind of design work I was learning, producing, and the kind of work that was being rewarded and what I understand as or I understood as good design. And I guess I learned what felt safe, what looked professional, quotation marks, and what didn't raise questions. And that safety often meant muting my own heritage on some level, my own politics, my own body, in favour of something flatter, perhaps a little bit quieter, and more legible to Eurocentric design standards. So I guess positionality here isn't just about identity, it's about how power teaches us to perhaps edit ourselves or contort ourselves. So that tension between what is lived and what is permitted, sits at the heart of the research. So I wanted to start with that, and I felt it was important to share. So thank you for letting me have those few moments. But yeah, now into perhaps a little bit more about what the PhD was grappling with at times, was these tensions between decolonisation and diversity and diversification. And I think it's something that a lot of people who are researching this have definitely spoken about and researched, but it's something that tends to keep coming up. This idea of decolonisation in design education feels like it's everywhere right now, which I personally don't have an issue with. I think it's important for it to be spoken about in different contexts, but it's coming up in course documents, in reading lists, in policy statements. And I think there's still many of us that feel that there's something that isn't quite shifting in a deep or structural way, even though it's been spoken about. So I guess that's where the research began, kind of from that observation of decolonisation often gets stuck at diversification. And absolutely diversification matters, representation matters, visibility matters. But diversification alone does not dismantle power. So you can diversify a curriculum and still assess students through colonial logics. You can diversify staff and still silence them institutionally. You can diversify references and still reproduce the same hierarchies of value. So I think decolonisation isn't about adding more voices into an unchanged system. It asks who decides what counts as good design, who feels safe to speak, who is protected when discomfort arises, and which forms of knowledge are recognised or dismissed. So yeah, my research kind of shifts the focus from what we teach to the conditions under which teaching and learning happen. So with the two parallels on the screen, I think, decolonisation is the right section. So it's addressing structures, it's addressing power, it's addressing conditions. Whereas I think sometimes we're perhaps getting stuck at the adding more content, these extra glimpses of different references, and it's how do we move, or how do we create the conditions where we can have conversations that move past the diversification conversation. And yeah, just thinking about the difference between those two words again is this idea of diversity as being about who gets to be in the room, and decolonisation is about what happens to the room itself. So the work of decolonisation is to unravel how knowledge is valued, how decisions are made, and whose ways of knowing shape the work. So when we talk about decolonising design education, we're not just talking about representation. We're talking about changing how design education thinks, which is a harder task on a lot of levels. And yeah, thinking about when we get stuck at diversification, it's this idea of the room looks different, but it works in the same way. And I think this is something that comes up a lot when people are having conversations about what it means to have visibility of perhaps other members of staff from alternative backgrounds that are outside of the Western Eurocentric way of thinking. They're adding those things in, but there still seems to not be something that's changing on a more structural level. And yeah, I think like a really big part of this research was a desire to think about what kinds of conditions allow other futures to be felt, not just described, but experienced even briefly. And my approach to decolonisation always comes from a position of hope. I'm not interested in kind of prediction or fantasy, but perhaps a way, to loosen the present, a way to hold critique and imagination alongside each other. So as I kind of go into this next stage of the presentation, how we might begin to create spaces where we can imagine alternative futures, this is, I guess, one of the main starting points is, is trying to find a way to move people past perhaps being a bit wrapped up in all of the present day, other things going on. We're all kind of facing either funding issues or just being exhausted. So there's other things that get in the way of us being able to imagine otherwise. So the next kind of stage will get into a little bit of that a bit more. So a way that I kind of began to approach that, and I'm not going to go into this in massive detail, so you'll all have to go and read my thesis, but it's the method that I kind of began to employ was a methodology that I came to develop as Artefactual Speculative Co-Storying, which is a design-led method that uses speculative artifacts to stage encounters where critique and imagination are produced together. So it treats participants as co-theorists, designing conditions for thinking otherwise. So I'm going to speak about two different parts of the study, which engaged with students with the artifact-led workshop, and then there'll be another section where I actually had some interviews with some educators of colour where we used the same approach, but it was all kind of using this method of using these speculative artifacts or prompts to stage these encounters where we could have conversations about what would a decolonised future for design education look like. So yeah, I'll start with the first, I guess, half of the research, which was based on the artifact that is on the screen right now, which was a workshop that was held with around 16 MA design students, and the artifact in question was a letter from a decolonised future. So as part of the research, I researched the present day, historical, all of that stuff of contemporary design education, and started to outline different problematic narratives as to, things that aren't quite as they should be. And then there was a creative writing element involved where I took those different aspects of things that they might consider would have changed in a decolonised future for design education, and wrote them into this letter that was delivered to the participants. So during the workshop, the participants examined the letter and identified areas that could be implemented in the present. So the method here is not about creating storytelling artifacts in isolation, but about placing those artifacts within kind of this carefully configured workshop scenario that encourages playing and like collective sense making. So the workshop took place over a full day, and these students, the majority of them came from international backgrounds, and they were studying their masters, but all from different design disciplines. So we spent the extended amount of time together as a group first to kind of dissecting our understanding of what it means to decolonize and their thoughts on the futures presented to them in the letter. And we discussed our heritages, our hopes, our ideas of the future, and whether or not they aligned with their hopes for how things could be. And yeah, we navigate potentials and stayed close to futures that centered care a lot of the times. And they began to tell stories of new futures in this like very tangible way, and allowed space for a community of people to bring their selves, their histories, their presence, their desires for the future into this one space where something kind of special happened, where they suspended the disbelief for a second and they could map out these otherwise realities. So I am going to show a few slides of some of the futures that the students proposed and kind of get at some of the themes that began to arise from those. So yes, this one was a future that one of the students proposed that compared us to flowers, in the sense that the group wanted to address some of the hierarchical issues identified in the present between educator and student, and thinking about who holds knowledge. There were a lot of international students from an Indian background in the group I spoke with, and they had a whole conversation about what it means to have elders within a community and the different kinds of knowledge they hold. And then they, proposed this future structure that built upon that thinking, and it relied on the watering of each other through that knowledge exchange. So they actually proposed a future where we wear these watering cans, and we'd walk around and physically water one another, which you'll start to see in some of these examples that they're often quite fantastical, but when you kind of strip them back and think about the different themes that they're beginning to unravel, whether that be about power structures or how we share knowledge and where knowledge is generated, there's some really interesting kind of ideas that start to emerge. Oh yeah, this future that was designed, operated via a pinball machine structure for design education that knew no disciplinary bounds. So a student would be thrown around different disciplines and eventually fall out a designer that had been impacted by all different ways of thinking and doing. And the conversations alongside this, again, was really interesting in terms of distinguishing the differences between art, craft, design, and these different conversations about where the lines are drawn between the different parts of what it means to be a creative. And they began dispelling what those different sections were. This participant began to explore crossover disciplines. So similar to the other, there was kind of thinking about what it means to create hybrid spaces. So they thought quite materially about what it would mean to have discussion spaces, who we would invite into those spaces, would it be open to the public? There was a lot of conversations that kind of got at the idea of what it means to be within a school and outside the school, and whose influences are we having, and especially thinking about having people from different heritages, different backgrounds coming into these spaces. The students began to highlight that a lot of the times they were parachute glimpses, they were kind of there and then they weren't. So there was this desire to create these central spaces within this future design school where these voices that resonated with them was more present. And this participant questioned whether the design school should exist at all and asked if that space was the most comfortable space for all. So they instead proposed a future treehouse design school that displaced students outside of the institutions we're familiar with and within the natural landscape instead. And again, all kinds of conversations about our relationship with the land and what that means as designers and how we design for our local environments came out of that conversation. Well, there were much more material interventions that were proposed to explore this idea of comfort and culture within educational spaces. So this was a future where the way we sit together was not completely dependent on Western ideas of comfort. So this student was asking, what if we sat on the floor together? What if the library included different ways of sitting that reflected different types of heritage? What if books were scrolls? so that group was able to have really quite critical conversations about the types of identities privileged in the design school through the prompts delivered to them through the letter. So you can begin to see that through this method of delivery, they were able to, on some level, free themselves from any kind of shackles of the present in a way that they weren't completely daunted by the future either. Thinking about the future can oftentimes be confusing. Yeah, and they were just a few kind of examples from a conversation that resulted in around 40 different sketches and futures, and a lot of notes that were proposed for this new world for design education. Yeah. And I think at that point, having spoken to the students, I can't remember exactly what point of the PhD that was now, but I was definitely approaching a point where I was heavily hopeful and inspired by the things coming out of it, but at the same time, really quite exhausted with this idea of things becoming actionable in any way. It felt that the next step had to be to engage with educators on some point, similar to myself, who might be coming across lots of kind of conversations about what it means to diversify, what it means to decolonize, and feeling exhausted with it. And anyway, there was a desire to want to reach out to people experiencing that. So the next part of these slides anyway is going to be thinking a little bit about what that entailed. So I went on to speak to 6 educators of colour from around the UK, all over, and I was kind of really interested in how I might develop the speculative approach in a way that would be perhaps more nuanced, a bit longer, a bit more intimate with the educators, to kind of hear their perspectives on things. So the way that happened was again to create some kind of artifact to hold those conversations. And this time round, I actually generated a fictional future design school called Make a Majlis, and it was a provocation of a design education somewhat in the nearish future, so it's around 2045, 2050. So we're situating ourselves a little bit further. And it again operated via this hopeful mindset of proposing these spaces that were built upon values, upon reciprocity, upon accountability, and kind of, so with that school anyway, created this induction pack for the Make a Majlis. And for those of you who might not be familiar with the word Majlis, so a Majlis is a traditional gathering space deeply rooted in Arab culture. So it's where many people come together to share stories, exchange knowledge, and engage in meaningful dialogue. So historically, the Majlis has served as a hub for community decision-making, storytelling, hospitality, and a space where every voice is valued and collective wisdom shapes outcomes. So in its essence, the Majlis embodies connection, respect, and the power of shared conversation. So on the screen right now was an induction pack for that future design school. Before I get onto that, to give a little bit of context as to where these educators were coming from, and before we get into any kind of speculations I had from the future, what I do want to do is share some of the quotes from the introductions before we had these more future-centered conversations, and I'm just going to read them aloud, and they're all different passages from these educators who I spoke and sat down with, and it was kind of backdropped against these themes of decolonisation. And I don't want to say too much about them. I'm going to let them speak for themselves, but it's more to paint the picture of how these educators have been moving through their different institutions and the different identities, and I will just read them. So one participant said, in terms of the work of decolonisation, is I really wish for them to stop throwing their homework on me because I'm exhausted of doing other people's homework. They said, you oppress me and then you hire me to clean your oppression. You want me to do the labour of undoing the oppression while you just sit and watch passively. And that passive gaze in itself reproduces the oppression. Another participant said, the institution is not genuinely interested in decolonisation, it is interested in selling a product that looks good through one lecture a year or a term about decolonisation, through a book reference in a reading list that nobody reads. And then I'll end with this one, but this participant said that there is an active resistance against dealing with colonialism as an event of the present. And I know for sure that in 10 years they will deal with the history because it's history, because it ended, because it cannot threaten their position. So what became interesting, having started with that as a kind of starting point, they shared their frustrations with the work of and the emotional labour involved with often being tasked with these roles of working towards decolonisation within the various institutions. But what became interesting in this next part, when they was interacting with the future school that was proposed to them in the induction pact, is they all of a sudden there was a lot lighter with how they were speaking about things. They was imagining these futures where things could be different, and that came through these moments that we were able to pull apart these prompts found in the induction pack and have conversations about what would a future design education look like. Yeah. So some of the things that came through those conversations was there was a suggestion of a future world where there was a traveling hub for stories, or a learning where learning was guided by personal values, where accountability shaped relationships, and there was these imagined worlds that started speaking about gathering through food, through singing. Yeah, a lot of it came through this way idea of engaging with people on a more human-centric level. Yeah, so many beautiful things that came out of that. And I think one thing that I think was interesting about this way of working was that make a Majlis, or with any of these artifacts, they didn't just make the hard stuff go away. They kind of kept propping up in the conversations, and it didn't bypass critique because that kept coming up, kind of the exhaustion and the emotional labor of taking this work on. But it changed the register, and it let critique sit beside kind of that longing, sit alongside the humor, alongside grief at times, and alongside possibility. So as a method, it begins to kind of hold these different tensions in the same place in a really interesting way, where you're able to have these conversations that that have an interesting rhythm to them. So they'll be kind of talking from personal experience and then exploring these alternative worlds where things are imagined differently, and then being able to bring some of that thinking back into a present context and thinking, how can we take these ideas and kind of action them in the present, or at least kind of send us on our way to get into those places. And I think, yeah, what you start to see is this idea of like dreaming changes conditions. I think once we take imagination seriously, we're forced to ask a harder question: what actually needs to change and what can't be carried forward at all? Which I guess brings me to kind of this idea of change versus collapse, which forms one of the later chapters in the thesis. I'm going to do a very, very, very watered down version of that, but it's this idea a lot of institutional decolonial work is framed around change, whether that be reform or adjustments or additions to the curriculum, more inclusive language, and change matters. But what participants made clear is that some institutional logics can't be changed from inside incremental reform. So collapse in this context doesn't mean destruction for its own sake. Collapse means allowing certain logics to fail, whether that be neutrality or universality, or the idea that design education is already fair if we just add more names. Collapse is when we stop trying to polish a system that continues to reproduce harm. And I think it comes back to that idea of the one educator who said that there is an active resistance against dealing with colonialism as an event of the present. Collapse names that resistance, and the speculative practice helps us stay with it without kind of rushing to fix it into something. So yeah, thinking about the things what can change, and there's a lot more articulation in other places about this, but this idea of curriculum, pedagogy, and space being the things where the possibility is, and there's great work being done in those spaces. But I think approaching things from trying to dispel the differences between the diversification, decolonisation within that space would really help us to kind of get on the way to making those changes. And then things that must collapse, this idea of tokenism or non-performativity, censorship, which came up a lot in the participant interviews with the educators, or commodified difference. So yeah, some of the things that what could change and what could collapse. Yeah, and this idea of collapse isn't only destructive, and I don't think it is destructive. I think it's a way of clearing space for other ways of doing. So to begin to, I guess, formulate some kind of ending, but this idea of through the study, there was certain commitments that kept kind of coming up, and towards the end, they was framed as a decolonial design framework that had 6 commitments. And I just to be clear about what it's not a checklist. It's not best practice, and not a toolkit by any means, as to kind of make decolonisation neat or deliverable. It's more of a constellation of commitments or orientations that hold the tensions of the work open. Yeah, and each commitment kind of answers slightly different questions. So we'll start with those. So yeah, the first commitment is this: so decolonisation begins with refusal. Some things cannot be changed, only refused. So like we've kind of been getting at this idea of not everything can or should be reformed. Participants made it clear that some things are not fixable, whether that be tokenistic diversity initiatives, performative inclusion, or the polite language of we're listening, while structures remain intact. So refusal here is not disengagement, it's not giving up, it's an active method that clears space. So some things that refusal might sound like is we won't participate in diversity as branding, or we won't keep translating ourselves into Eurocentric norms to be legible. We won't keep treating oppression as something we must personally fix while institutions watch. So this commitment asks institutions and educators to distinguish between what can be repaired and what must collapse, recognising that some futures begin not with addition but with refusal. Number 2 is that plural knowledge is the ground, not the add-on. So not diversifying the canon, unsettling it. So a lot of diversification gets reduced to add diverse references, but what participants called for was not supplementation, it was rerouting. That means Indigenous, diasporic, and community-based epistemologies are not extra readings, they're foundations. It also means that oral traditions, storytelling, community archives, lived practices are legitimate sources of design knowledge. And crucially, this isn't only about what is taught, it's about authority. who is allowed to be theory, who is allowed to produce knowledge. So rerouting curriculum means moving away from a canon that decides legitimacy through Eurocentric categories and towards living knowledge systems where students participate in knowledge making rather than simply consuming a hierarchy of names. So the third one is pedagogy as a practice of care and horizontality. So how we teach matters just as much as what we teach. So it came across in both the students and educators' accounts. So care wasn't softness, care was infrastructure, the conditions that decide whether someone can risk, disagree, fail, or bring themselves fully into a space. So care created atmospheres where authenticity could surface without punishment. And horizontality is how that care is enacted. So thinking about flattening critique hierarchies or treating students as co-theorists, not passive receivers. So I think, here we can see how pedagogy becomes that decolonial vehicle for delivering knowledge, but a relational practice, grounded in reciprocity, vulnerability, and shared responsibility. And the fourth one, which is an interesting one, is this idea of assessment must be values-based and reciprocal. Accountability rooted in values, not comparison, which on some level feels like quite a radical thing to suggest. But what kept coming through, whether it be in the students or the educators' proposals for these decolonised futures, was where we was making work that was, when we're thinking about being assessed, they weren't quite using the word assessed, but assessed on some level against the values that we hold as people. So what would it look like in a world where students generated their own learning outcomes that was rooted in their values, and then everyone was assessed alongside their different ways of knowing? What would that look like? So yeah, they proposed alternatives, this idea of values compasses instead of grades, co-authored rubrics, peer accountability, assessment grounded in commitment. And yeah, it's not about lowering standards, but it's about changing what the standards are, what kept coming through. So from how well do you match the canon to how accountable is your practice to your values, your relations, your impacts. So yeah, it becomes about that shared method. Getting ahead of ourselves. Number 5 is institutions must be accountable, not performative. Decolonising work needs protecting. So participants described universities that celebrate critical work symbolically while withholding either resources, protection, and power for those doing it. So I guess the commitment here is quite blunt. If decolonisation is real, it kind of has to become material. And that means secure contracts for staff of colour, redistribution of resources, governance power where decisions are made, protection of political speech and dissent, and decolonial labour recognised as core work, not voluntary extra work. So without that kind of structural accountability, curriculum change and care-based pedagogy remain quite fragile openings. So it's I guess on some level about this idea of protecting that work. And then finally, number 6, this idea of imagination is method, not luxury, which I guess is the heart of the study. This idea of dreaming otherwise is how futures are rehearsed. So critique can name what's wrong, but it can't always rehearse what's possible. So speculation and imagination allows those two things to coexist. So I guess the commitment places imagination at the centre of that decolonial practice, not as an escape, but yeah, as rigorous rehearsal. And I didn't know you was going to actually start with that intro, James, but I actually put this towards the end, this idea of small is good, small is all, and the large is a reflection of the small. And I do believe in that deeply. I think, even just having these conversations and continuing to have these conversations is so important, because I guess this work is always on some level unfinished. It's slow. it's uneven and it's often exhausting and it requires hope. And yeah, many of the people I spoke with, especially the educators of colour, were already tired before they began. Tired of explaining, tired of being visible without being protected, tired of carrying hope on behalf of students that haven't earned it on some levels. So yeah, when I say this kind of work requires hope, I don't necessarily mean optimism. Yeah, I mean hope as a practice, although I am a forever optimist, as some, thinking about hope as something we choose to return to even if we know the conditions are hostile. So hope as a refusal to let exhaustion become the final word. Hope as something collective, not something individuals are asked to carry alone. And yeah, this research didn't make me any more certain, but it did make me, I think, more committed. And I think committed to this idea of slowness, to care, to stay in with the discomfort rather than rushing towards a resolution. And I think that's perhaps what this unfinished work kind of asks of us, to not have that clarity, but I guess the willingness to remain in conversation and to keep making spaces for imagining otherwise, even when it's tricky. And I have a very short clip to end with some words from Audre Lorde, and then I'll shut up because she will finish it better than me. But this is on hope.
While we're surviving in the mouth of this dragon, we also need to be feeding our vision.
Which is one of the vital necessities of art in everyday life.
Which is one of devising a future where we will live in some place other than the teeth of the dragon, maybe if not in my lifetime or even in my children's lifetime, that we will all contribute to what is known as the great going forward, that eventually we will be on dragonhood.
You believe in the notion of progress, do you?
I suppose if you want to call it that, yeah.
It makes you very American.
Oh, does it?
Yes.
Well,
we will all get to heaven by and by somehow.
No, I don't consider it heaven at all. I consider it, no, I have my vision is formed in a very different way from that, Judy. It has nothing to do with heaven. It has to do with the imperfections of a world that I am living in, and that my work is to help alter. I do believe in evolution, and that is different from the concept of progress.
So you haven't felt
that if we can survive, and if we can teach, if we can keep this whole crazy thing going long enough, we will find a way out.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Layla. Before we open it up to questions, I think we should all get on that react button and the equivalent to a digital applause, I guess.
Thank you.
So thank you so much. We have, in the spirit of remaining unfinished, at least for another 10 minutes, in terms of this event remaining unfinished, we've got a bit of time for questions for Layla. Myself and Nicole are going to manage them between hands going up and stuff in the chat. So maybe we'll start, Nicole, give people a chance to form some questions who might want to put their hands up. Is there anything in the chat you want to go to as a first question for Layla?
Yeah, we've got loads of questions. I just go with the first one. They're all great. Maurice asked, where have you met most resistance, dismissal, or challenges of putting your work in practice as opposed to principles, ideas within academia? And how did you navigate these instances?
That's a good question. I feel like I've been very lucky with the places that I've been in terms of not being met with refusal in a lot of ways. I think a lot of the research at the beginning of the study came from my own earlier education in terms of navigating how perhaps perhaps things had been delivered in a way that presented Eurocentric norms as the most dominant. I do think that is still coming through in a lot of places in terms of, especially within graphic design, that's kind of the space I come from. in terms of modernism and what that means. So I think there's definitely still work to be done in terms of unraveling that a little bit more. But in terms of putting ideas into practice and testing out these different workshops and events, I feel like I've been very lucky, and I understand that's a privilege to be able to have had those spaces to test these ideas. I'm trying to read the questions. I'm not sure if I'm answering that right. I think it's always interesting working with educators on some of these like bigger future ideas because of how wrapped up they are in other factors that affect the way we can do this work, which I understand there's a lot of time constraints and people are very busy, and this work often gets pushed to the side a little bit. But I think it's just about continuing the conversation and keep making spaces for these and this work to happen. Sorry, Moise, if that didn't answer your question.
We go to James.
Okay, so I'll go to the hand, and then maybe we'll come back to some of the ones in the chat. So I'm going to hand over to Michael.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Michael.
Okay. So thank you for sharing this wonderful journey with us and your insights. I have a question about your process. So I'm supervising a few PhDs as well at the moment about education and diversity. And I wonder how your supervisors reacted when you suddenly discovered in your process that a lot of what you were researching had actually to do with yourself and your heritage and your background, your life, so to speak. And so I had a similar experience. And so were your supervisors the one that pointed out the connection, or did you discover it on your own? And how did they react when it suddenly merged? I wonder.
I don't know, maybe we should ask my supervisor. No, I'm joking, Jake. I think it definitely was not easy work, and I think it did not happen right at the start of the PhD, and the study changed a lot over time as I kind of began unraveling things a little bit more. And when I was kind of looking back recently on some of the earlier stuff, which I think is natural, but I feel like it has developed and it did become more personal. I think that moment where I kind of made an active commitment to bringing those narratives and that way of thinking into the work, which was a active thing, and it still feels quite uncomfortable. And that's why I forced myself to kind of make it very known in terms of speaking about things. It kind of becomes easier. I think we've all been in these spaces for quite some time now, especially within like a UK design context. We kind of have all of these ideals and kind of bringing in these new things, even if it's kind of trendy at the moment to be doing this work, still feels quite hard. So I think it was just part of the process, and I think it came over time.
Thank you. Yes, I think it has to do with research honesty. Yeah, you just follow the process, you learn, and then it's a kind of transformative process. And you're lucky if you have supervisors that support that. Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
James, do you want me to go to the next one in the chat?
Yeah, go to the chat. Yeah, please do.
It's a good one. Watson Ed ask: Is this anything? Is this specific to design? Was it different? Is it? Could it apply to any subject, basically? And what makes it specific? Is it? If it is.
Yeah, that's a good question. The study itself was obviously very specific to design, although I shifted away from specifying which one of design. I was very open to it being just about design education in more broader context. I think we're all facing these different issues. But in the thesis, I do go on to say that this is, an approach that could be definitely used in different fields, and I'd be interested in how it could be. I think it at the end of the day, it came through just sitting down and researching the different narratives of the history and the present and the future of design education. But if you was to do that with any subject and create these and facilitate those speculative encounters, I think as a method, I think that could definitely be established in various contexts. But yes, it is. I focused on design education. I think it could be used as an approach elsewhere too.
Thanks again, Layla. There's some really good questions in the chat, Nicole. Do you want to keep just picking? I can't see any hands, so let's go with that.
I'll go. Yeah. So thanks, Layla. Really thoughtful. So there's also Gillian asked, you talked early on about the difference between fantasizing and imagining. It's an important difference. Could you talk a bit more about your manifest, how this manifests in your research, practically?
Yes, I think what you're trying to get at, and I think what I mentioned was this idea of not just fantasizing for the sake of having these thoughts about the future. And I think a lot of my practice is kind of based on ideas of speculative design, and I've always been quite critical of that. Of if we're going to rehearse these futures, then they need to be trying to make some kind of actionable change in the present. So I think that's where the difference between creating these spaces for collective imagining becomes really important to me. That's why I was always kind of interested in creating spaces where multiple people with multiple identities and heritage and all of these different stories came together in those spaces. So I think, yeah, collective imagining is what I'm more interested in. It's probably like the solo fantasizing is probably not so productive. So I think that's the distinction of those two words.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the practicality of it is that you work with workshops and try to facilitate conversations around that. Yeah, that makes sense. It's great. Okay, let me quickly scroll. Is there no other hand? You're very welcome. Before I go to another question.
There's a great one on taste in the chat.
Thank you, Pallavi.
Oh, Layla, this is my morning, and it is just lovely to wake up to a call with so much hope and so much warmth in the work that you're doing. So my question to you is that you speak of speculative artifactual thinking and workshops, and some of my work has been around thinking about how we can hold artifacts of our past to understand how design pedagogy could be shaped in the future. So I'm wondering if there were instances where you use that methodology.
Yeah, that's a really good question.
Please let me know if you want me to rephrase. I don't know if I was able to sort of put it out well enough.
I think I might have an idea of what you're trying to get at, but you can correct me if I'm wrong too. When I guess dealing with these future scenarios, a lot of the time, especially within speculative design, sometimes detached from any kind of accountability or past. And I think an important part in bringing speculation in conversation with work such as decolonisation, it's really important for that to be in conversation with the past and with history. So I guess if we're thinking about within the design kind of process of what went into creating those artifacts, a big part before you kind of see the thing and the people is that kind of really embeddedness within the history of where these ideas are coming from that are shaping our present day design education. So it's, going back as far as need, but thinking about how these notions of whether that be taste or whatever is formed historically, and then putting all of that thinking into creating these future artifacts that can hold these conversations. So I was always kind of interested in the idea of past, present, and future being in kind of this space where we can be in conversation with them simultaneously. I don't know if that answers your question. I hope it did.
That's great. I really like it. It really connects to the idea of the tension you had between hope and collapse, isn't it? It's like this something in between the past and present. And okay, the very last question, we are a little bit over, but it's really interesting. The questions are really bringing out some good ideas. So I really want to come to the taste one, if that's all right. So Nicholas has asked, I'm interested in the idea of taste, specifically in Design Academy. Do you think that taste is a colonial idea itself? Should we collapse the idea of taste?
I would say yes. Yeah, I think it it's that idea again of where does this notion of good design come from, or good taste, and I think a lot of the time it's coming from a very specific part of the world, and then there's a part in the research that kind of begins to distinguish the difference between design and craft, which is always an interesting conversation. It's usually anything that's outside of like the Euro-American taste point of view is deemed as craft or something more heritage-based practice. They come out with these kind of other words. So it's, yeah, in terms of like this in the design space, I think there's really an interesting conversation about where these notions of what is considered tasteful or good design. I think it definitely is tied to, that's where it's all kind of coming from, this idea of colonialism and the agenda of what it means to have those different notions of taste. So yes, in short, and I think yes, let's collapse it too.
That sounds good to me.
Lala. Sorry, Nicole.
No, absolutely. There's one more question in the chat. Do you want to squeeze it in, or you want to finish off?
Just squeeze it in, and then we'll go for it.
Okay, so the question comes from Puri Gag, and they ask, how would you draw the line between basic equitability or equality in education and decoloniality in education? I think you've actually, dealt with this in your presentation. But anyway, so for example, plurality in general should be the basis for education in all senses. How did you draw the connection from enabling plurality to decolonization? Or in short, how do you truly define that what you are researching and doing is truly decolonial? Hope that makes sense.
That makes sense. I think it's definitely a good question. I think a big part of the work of decolonizing is shifting power, which is, I think, the most important part, which I think moves past just this idea of plurality. It's shifting power from people who've perhaps been the most marginalized in this context by design education. So how do you draw the connection? Yeah, I'm not sure. I think it kind of covered it earlier on, the idea of the shifting of the power in those different structures. I think is important for this work, and being accountable and honest with the kinds of spaces we're coming from, I think is all part of the this work. Sorry if that's not a great way of answering that question.
Thank you, Lala. Thank you so much for a fantastic, inspiring and hopeful talk today. I hope you'll have a moment, or you'll have the chance to look at some of the stuff that was put in the chat. You'll be able to feel the warmth and the impact I think your talks had today. I'm going to suggest one more round of reactions, claps, or however you want to do it, to say thank you very much to Lala for her contribution today.
I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for all taking the time to be with us.
And in the spirit of sorry, Layla, in the spirit of unfinishedness, you kind of right at the beginning, you invited people to connect with you if they want to continue the conversation, I assume. Do you want to just repeat that in case there's those that came in later, how they might be able to find you?
Yeah, of course. I'm an Instagram girly, so you can find me at Lala Gharib Design, or I'm also on LinkedIn, just my name. So yeah, let's continue the conversation.
Thank you so much. And thank you all so much for coming. It's wonderful to see so many people and hear from so many people today. Have a good morning, day, lunch, evening, sleep, folks. Take good care.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for a great talk.